This is Billy Kay, welcoming you to a history of Scottish literature. Programme 3, The Solace of Mankind.
Thanks to our noble reform, we have no dancing, no players and no playing, no high music and precious little painting save of scowling men with long beards. All we have is a handful of old songs sung to bare, shivering tunes. Lord knows our graces are few enough in Scotland, but they dirl like an auger right to the bone.
The oral tradition in Scotland has been very strong. I think the ballads are one of the golden periods, if you like, of literature. The power of the Scottish ballads are second to none, I think, in world literature.
Author of The Literature of Scotland, Rory Watson, and writer Andrew Gregg, reading from his novel Fair Helen and describing the literary landscape in 17th century Scotland, with court patronage o'er the border and the wa, and the vibrant folk traditions of story, ballad and song relied upon to keep the culture alive. But who composed the muckle sangs, the great ballads? Ian Campbell of Edinburgh and Elizabeth Ewan of Guelph University.
Of course, they're mostly anonymous, but there's a saying, anonymous was a woman. They really emerged from the 16th century onwards. There's a lot of them that actually just refer to women's experiences and experiences of courtship and marriage, bearing illegitimate children, many of them, again, from a woman's voice. And the tradition is actually carried on by women. Most of the ballads which were collected by the 18th and 19th century ballad collectors, a very high proportion of them actually came from women.
When Scott went to the borders, the wonderful ballad tradition that he and Burns and Hogg himself were collecting was just dying. And a quote I've often used, Hogg's mother, after Scott had written down some of her poems, admonished him, "My ballads were made to be sung and no to be printed. And now you hae printed them, you have spoiled them altogether, and they'll never be sung mair." If he hadn't written them, they would have been forgotten. Because he wrote them, they were petrified and have survived for us, but they'll not be sung in the sense she meant.
Collectors like Burns, like David Herd before him, like Alan Ramsay actually right at the beginning of the 18th century, he's the man that kind of starts it all off. They've been entertained by songs and stories. Childhood memories of mums who could sing really well, or friends of mothers who came in and told wonderful ghost stories. You can tell even by the way they recount that in later life how inspiring it was. I mean, really inspirational and very stimulating to their creative sense.
Kirstine McHugh of Glasgow University. And these influences are still there, with Scottish and African oral traditions stimulating one of our great storytellers of the 21st century, Alexander McCall Smith.
The first time I ever heard of you was my daughter, who studied law at Edinburgh University, coming home and telling me about these amazing lectures she was getting, where the lecturer told stories.
Well, that's what law is about, because law, in essence, is a series of stories and their resolution. So that wasn't perhaps all that surprising, and I think probably she was referring to my lectures in criminal law, which of course are full of very interesting stories, most of them fairly unpleasant.
The border ballads, they come to seem to me, just the DNA of our literature. Fair Helen of Kirkconnell Lee, I think it's the 6th ballad in Scots minstrelsy of the Scottish borders.
I wish my grave was ground green, winding sheet to dollar my ing, and I in Helen's arms, Lean and Fair Kirkconnell. I wish I were Helen lies, night and day, on me she cries, oh that I were Helen lies, and Fair Kirkconnell.
The ballad of Fair Helen inspired Andrew to reimagine the story behind the song in a hauntingly poetic novel, firmly rooted in the Scottish literary tradition.
I have heard the unprepossessing half-cut Macker Montgomery speak his verse and strike a smoky, worldly room dumb. And in Firenze, an ordinary venal youth summoned the entire angelic order as he sang his solo. Then 10 minutes later, I saw him pick his nose, bored, spotty and plain, as he sat again amongst the choir. So it was with fair Helen and her beauty. She did not own it any more than the singer owns the song, or the macker owns the poem. She was but its vessel. I believe she was scunnered by it, at the effect it had on others who failed to see her, being dazzled by the light that poured through her. Yet she said I knew her, and I took her word.
Lovely.
That last line was the only time I'd consciously, cheekily echo a Dylan song. Yet you said you knew me, and I took your word. It's from Sooner or Later One of Us Must Know and Blonde on Blonde.
He was influenced by the ballads.
Dylan is hugely...
Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands.
Yep. I mean, Dylan once said, you think my songs are weird, you should read this stuff. It's people turning into birds. And he was absolutely right. And also, one time I saw him in Glasgow, he sang Annie Laurie.
Later in the series, we'll explore the supernatural shiver of the ballads and their literary legacy in dark genre such as Gothic, fantasy and art noir. But from the 18th century to the present day, Scots song has been one of the great carriers of Scottish identity. Val McDermott and Murray Pittock of Glasgow University.
The traditional song of Scotland done in the last years of primary school that is the bedrock for saying, what's here? Why is it being missed? Why am I not hearing it round me? You know, Seamus Heaney said, that he used to hear the weather forecast and it always seemed to be happening somewhere else. Well, I used to always hear about literature and history and it always seemed to be happening somewhere else. And here was something which allowed it to happen here.
I remember much more a family tradition of song. And of course, a lot of traditional Scottish song is about story as well. The ballads, the murder ballads like the Twa Corbies, they were all about stories, telling a story in a song.
And that's one of the great things about it, that in itself it represents a certain classless access to the whole culture of Scotland, which is there throughout not only the song, but the writing too. There are so many points of access to who we are in the writing and traditional literature and song of Scotland.
Following the Union of 1707, Now There's an End o' an Old Sang, amidst a growing fear of assimilation, there arose a counter-cultural movement celebrating Scots language and literature and song in collections by Watson, Ruddiman, Hamilton of Gilbertfield and Alan Ramsay, who also put down the roots of another impressive branch of what we now call the democratic intellect. Rona Brown of Glasgow University.
Ramsay is thought to have been the founder of the first circulating library in the UK, the very first one. It's well known that in Scotland literacy rates were quite high because of parish schools and the fact that smaller, more rural communities did have access to education. Folk like Burns had pretty good education that they could build on in their adult lives with their reading.
My parents understood that the way for you to get a better life for your kids than they had was through education, and they always encouraged me to read. And the big thing that they did for me was when I was 6 years old, they moved house to live opposite the Central Library in Kirkcaldy. And that for me was like a treasure trove. I could go there every night after school and I could borrow books and I could read to my heart's content, and nobody told me what I could and couldn't read. So I just read my way around the shelves. Because back in those days, Presbyterianism was still strong in the land. So although you could take out 4 books at a time, 2 of them had to be non-fiction. Because, you couldn't just enjoy yourself. But in a way, that served me well, really, because it forced me to read things I wouldn't have read necessarily otherwise.
Ramsay also founds a theatre in Edinburgh and he founds an art school. And that's all part of trying to make Edinburgh still in some sense a cultural capital.
Publishers find it profitable to publish these books, but the Bannatyne manuscripts are rediscovered and republished in the Evergreen and various anthologies that Ramsay puts together, drawing attention to the Mackers. So the Mackers are rediscovered in the 18th century.
He was a wig maker, and of course in those days folk wore elaborate powdered curled wigs, and his shop was a meeting place. He's got an autobiographical poem, I theek the oot and line the inside o' mony a douce and worthy pash. That is really clever. I thatch the outside of their heads and line the inside. In other words, I make wigs, and I keep a library, a bookshop, which provides material for the inside the mental stimulation. I mak what honest shift I can, and in my ain house I'm good man, which stands on Embra Street the sun side. I think the out and line the inside o' many a douce and worthy pash, and baithwise gather in the cash.
Derek McClure of Aberdeen University. While Ramsay was very much a Jacobite and his Easy Club a hotbed of political nationalism, his work was equally in vogue elsewhere. Penny Fielding of Edinburgh and Jerry Cruthers of Glasgow University.
Alan Ramsay has a British-wide audience. If you look at the subscribers to his collected poems of 1720, it's people like Alexander Pope, John Gay. And this is the period when people are getting into dialect, getting into the rustic sensibility, getting into the idea of the beggar's opera and so on. So there's a kind of rustic dialect chic going on that is pan-British.
That introduces an idea of Scottish culture as something which is marketable, because Ramsay sold those volumes in London and he made a fair amount of money from them.
Well, The Gentle Shepherd is really the text that Ramsay was known for. It's hard to overestimate just how popular it was. It went through lots and lots of editions throughout the 19th century. It was performed a lot, and I don't just mean in Scotland, in London. It was really enduring on the stage in London.
One of the most beautiful versions I've ever heard of a song from my own Irvine Valley, the Lassapetes Mill, sung by an English tenor, and it's absolutely exquisite. It's beautiful.
Well, Lassapetes Mill and Cornrigs, which also comes from Ramsay's The Gentle Shepherd, those are songs that Ramsay includes in his pastoral comedy. So again, like the Beggar's Opera, a kind of drama with songs. And the songs are just an absolute hit.
The lass of pages meal, so bonny, blithe and gay, in spite of all my skill, she stole my heart away. When tearing on the hay, beheaded on the green, love midst her locks did play, and wanton in her ear.
There is a period when Scots is quite a hot ticket in England. You see this, for instance, I suppose in 1771, Smollett's novel, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, where it's joked about that Scots is very fashionable, and the people visiting from England and Wales start also to mimic the Scots cadences. I think in a lot of ways, Scots song is almost the calling card for Scots poetry.
This was also revealed in increasing interchange between Lowland and Highland culture. Willie Gillis of Edinburgh, Alan Reich and Murray Pittock of Glasgow University.
Gaelic writing comes into contact for the first time with the kind of genres used by other Scottish writers, so that there is a holistic cultural realm, and a lot of that's geared to support for the institutions that Scotland has lost in 1707, the Parliament. That's very much associated with the native dynasty, the Stuarts, because the Stuarts are seen as the only realistic political military option for restoring the Parliament in the first half of the 18th century.
Duncan Ban McIntyre fought with the Hanoverians reluctantly, and the story is that he threw his sword away. He couldn't do it. He just thought that the divided loyalties of this situation were too wrong. And Alistair McMaster Alistair fought with the Jacobites. You think the two greatest Gaelic poets of that era on opposite sides in this, what was essentially a civil war.
The guy that you know about is Alistair MacLeister Alistair, because you know that he went to university and he was clearly influenced by the Lowland Scots tradition of lyrics and things like that, actually reading the Tea Table Miscellany and that sort of thing. And the early Gaelic collections, which start in the 18th century, actually put in Faun Black Jock, to the tune of Black Jock, to the tune of the Lassapetes Mill and so on.
The other crossover that I know of is the tune to Ye Fond Kiss and Then We Sever. It was in the Captain's collection.
The Simon Fraser collection.
That's right, yes. Simon Fraser.
That is certainly happening in a widespread sort of way.
White Rose Rebel, the title is drawn from the Jacobite Rose, which actually commemorates the birth of James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, because he was born in June, and that's when the White Rose of Scotland blooms, in June and on into July. A beautifully perfumed small rose, which I happen to have grown in my garden because it's been passed down through the women for generations. You just get a bit off the root when you get your own garden to plant, and all the women in my family have a Jacobite rose grown in their garden. Inside the book it quotes Hugh MacDiarmid's poem, The Little White Rose, which is of course about the self-same Jacobite rose, the White Rose of Scotland. The rose of all the world is not for me. I want for my part only the little white rose of Scotland that smells sharp and sweet and breaks the heart.
Janet Paisley on her novel White Rose Rebel. With Rob Down Mackay, Alistair MacVisher Alistair and Uliam Ross among many great Gaelic poets of the era, one of the most memorable poems is Duncan Ban MacIntyre's Paean of Praise for his native Glenorchy and the mountain landscape of Bendoran.
An thorm hargach bain ek Bendorain, na chunami von grain si bevoichelum.
It's about beauty, the mountain itself. It's also about the movement of the deer, the herds of deer, and the individual deer that you see moving, your vision of movement as the poem moves, so the animals move. A herd of the deer, each startles at once, and they leap as if one, and it starts. The bounding of bodies, the weight in their forms, in movement away, their white rumps up, bobbing, away, in a spray, an array, they are grace in their movement, yet skittish, prompted by fear, carried by muscle, charged by instinctual sense. Equally so, the shy, sombre stag, in his warm brown coat, the russet of fur, his antlers raised high, stately and slow, he walks by.
Alan Riach with his translation. But while Duncan Ban chased the wild deer as a young man, in later years, like many Highlanders, he joined the City Guard of Edinburgh, which Robert Ferguson called the Black Banditti because of their reputation for police brutality. So the greatest Gaelic and Scots poets of the age possibly confronted each other on the steering streets of Aldrichy.
What I like about Ferguson is, exactly as Stevenson says, that fizzing vitality, because he brings a real youthfulness to his work. I would argue he's a bit more than a city poet, but he gets Edinburgh. He captures something about Edinburgh that's really quite special. You can almost smell the streets in something like Aldrichy.
Gillespie's snuff should prime the nose with her that to the market goes, if she would like to shun the smells that float around frae market cells, where whimes of Painsy's savoury scent to nostrils gie great discontent.
The Elegy on the Death of Scots Music, he uses the exact form that Ramsay would have used in Elegy on Maggie Johnson, which is all about drinking and laughter and fun and being sick. And Ferguson uses this to bemoan the death, as he saw it, of his native culture, especially the music in Scotland that was being changed by the influx of interest in Italian music.
But Banny's vile Italian
Yep.
tricks through your quorum,
Yep, exactly
not fortes
that.
with pianos mix.
Gies Tulloch Gorum.
It's like a call to arms
Yeah, it
almost, isn't
certainly
it?
is. Especially at the end of the poem when he says, "Let's fight till music is restored." It's got some tongue-in-cheek stuff in there, but it's also quite a serious worry about the future of Scottish culture.
The tongue-in-cheek that I think is there is he was a big pal of an Italian tenor called Tenducci.
Yes, he was.
And he keeps referring to Italians as a bastard breed, meaning
Yep,
the music.
that's right, yep.
But I can sure he'd be looking at his pal when he was saying that and winding him up.
I'm pretty sure, because they seemed to be quite close for a while. They had some kind of quarrel where they stopped speaking to each other and Tenducci went away. But there's a story in 19th century biographies of Ferguson that Tenducci could never suppress a tear every time Ferguson was mentioned after the poet died. So there was a close bond there, I think.
The poet died tragically young at the age of 24 and was buried in the Canongate Kirkyard, where Robert Burns, calling him my elder brother in misfortune, by far my elder brother in the muse, paid for the headstone that marks his grave. But Ferguson still donner and doon the Canongate in a life-size statue by David Annand, another brother in the muse, James Robertson.
You see folk there getting their photos taken next to him and with their arms round him and so on. I thought how brilliant and wonderful that is. Poor man died at 24, but he's still there, still part of the life of the old tune. So this is my poem called Ferguson's Statue. You're striding down the Canongate, brent new, and looking like you've never been awa, when never found curled deed upon the straw in Bedlam's cells. You're 24 and fou, no claret fou, but o' yoursel and life, rat rhymes and habbies rattling through your head, a book in hand and hundreds mair to read. The world is yours, at least as far as Fife. You'd ken, and yet you wouldn't ken your tune. Some gains you'd praise, some losses you'd lament. Sae muckle change, sae muckle aye the same. All Dreeky's still as braw beneath the moon, and now we even hae our Parliament. Come hame like you, Rab Ferguson. Come hame.
Carved fate that I should banished be, gang heavily and mourn, because I lewd the warmest dram that here and mouth did burn.
He was a member of the Cape Club. Lots of artists were members of the Cape Club, so it gave him access to that bigger cultural scene. He was also a big theatre fan. Lots of the actors, theatre managers were members of the Cape Club.
Did they have premises?
Well, it moved around. They referred to wherever they met as Cape Hall, or the Shades, as it's sometimes referred to. And it would be in various different taverns.
Oh, the Shades, the Calar Shades, where I have oft remained, till
Yep.
Lucky's bottle CFD was to the bottom.
That's right.
Great.
CFD stands for Concordia Fratrum Decus, which basically means harmony among brothers is a great thing.
He's hanging out with the Episcopalians, with these guys who still have got Jacobite sensibilities quarter of a century after the 1745 rebellion. The northeast remains, at least down to the 1790s, the hotbeds of Scoto-Latinity, of Jacobitism, of anti-Hanoverianism. It's all these sort of things that to some extent Burns takes from Ferguson and other people and re-imports into Ayrshire.
Ferguson and Ramsay's Scots poetry inspired Burns to set aside derivative neoclassic English verse for the vir and smedum of his mother tongue. And so a cult was born. Ayrshire poet Rab Wilson.
Burns, I suppose, opened the door to this for me. But since that, I read widely and steeped my hands in all the great Scots poets of the last 200 years. And in the last 100 years with MacDiarmid and Garioch, Willie Neal, these are great inspirations to me, these folk. And I feel that I'm carrying that tradition for it.
There's lots of positives. There's a real identity in Ayrshire that's connected with Burns, I think. There's a bit of disagreement between Ayrshire and Dumfriesshire about who actually owns Burns. We had him when he was born. We had him when he was...
contest. He's an Ayrshire poet.
Yeah, I agree. But certainly there's a lot of pride connected with Burns in Ayrshire.
I wonder how unique that is in world literature, that Burns phenomenon. When my wife first came to Scotland to go to the Scottish University Summer School from Portugal, on the cab going into the hall of residence, the taxi driver asked her what she was doing. She said, "I'm here to study English literature." And the taxi driver says, "Well, while you're here, you should learn some Scottish literature." And he proceeded to recite Burns by heart the whole way into central Edinburgh. And my wife, who was used to Lisbon taxi drivers,
Yeah, it was a shock.
This was quite a cultural shock. She realised she was in a different place. I wonder how unique it is.
I think it's pretty unique, actually, because It's difficult to think of any other poet that is celebrated in the way that Burns is celebrated in something like the Burns Supper.
Burns was in my parents' house. My father was a big Burns man. He was a member of the Bowhill People's Burns Club. He was the lead tenor in the concert party. The ideas of Burns kind of infiltrated the life in the house. And he certainly instilled in me the notion that I was as good as anyone. Wherever I find myself, I can always hear his voice at my shoulder going, a man's a man for all that.
Kings may be blessed. Well, Tam is as good as any king. And meanwhile, over in France, royalty and aristocrats are getting their heads chopped off. There is a sense that there's a revolutionary potential in the romantic assertion of the individual authority of Tam, as good as any aristocrat, which is a complete challenge to the order of the classical world and the Enlightenment sense of order. That's a revolutionary proposition. And Burns is a revolutionary proposition. He is absolutely in tune with all of the great writers of liberty. You think of Pablo Neruda, you think of Bertolt Brecht, you think of Hugh MacDiarmid, you think of some of the great revolutionary writers of the 20th century, and you think of Burns in their company.
The American writer Emerson wrote that people who care nothing for literature and poetry care for Burns, for his songs are known by heart and are the property and solace of mankind. Next, we'll hear how Scott and Burns became icons of the European Romantic movement. But I'll leave you with two views on Burns's songs, from Janice Galloway, who sings them, and from Jerry Crothers, on a controversial reason why he may have devoted the end of his life to them.
Of course, the person I knew most about, because I sang it all the time, was Burns. And I think the Burns songs, in many ways, interest me, intrigue me, and take me into more than the Burns poems, because they're not just his work. They are communal work. They are gleaned work. And the songs, there were also some about women. Burns put, I think, his best work into the songs. He put his hardest graft and his least well-paid work into the songs, and I'm profoundly grateful to him for that.
By the 1790s, Burns is an exciseman, and very often he and the people don't get on because he's spoiling people's fun. And to some extent, Burns takes refuge from hostility from the people in going into their culture, and there's a compensatory thing going on where, of course, by the end of his life, Burns is the greatest collector of Scots song of all time.